Thank you for checking out another episode of the What is Cycling podcast. On today's episode, you are going to learn from a national and world's track cycling champion, Kaitlyn Mittan. We are going to learn all about track cycling, what it's like to be a cycling coach, and why you should eat your beets. So get ready to learn. So I guess let's just dive right in, because we are speaking today to Kaitlyn, who is a beast at the track racing. She is the 2022 Masters Track Champion. And so I want you to teach me everything about track racing, because I know nothing. I know it's in a velodrome, but other than that, I know nothing. So can you just give me the rundown of track racing?
It's very complicated. And I don't know where to start. I can start by saying I am by no means the expert. I have a little bit of experience and was fortunate to kind of get connected and recruited and mentored by some of the best of the best. And so my learning curve was not quite as steep as it could have been, because I had such good mentors and friends and teammates helping me learn the ropes. So I would say the primary difference, well, not the primary difference, one of the differences between track and road is you've got one gear and no brakes. So when you're racing, you know that the person in front of you is always going to be pedaling. They're not going to hit the brakes. They might slow down, which you'll have to, modulate your pedaling stroke and figure out how to do that. But there's always forward movement. Yeah. So that is the first thing. And what comes along with that is that you can't stop pedaling. You have to keep going. I remember the first time I was on a track bike and I tried to stop pedaling, and it just kind of jolts your body.
Yeah, it throws you off the saddle. I had a Aviton Matera Low of Fixie, and it was a track bike, and yeah, that was a very rude awakening, because I remember I guess the free hubs, but you pedal backwards to stop as a kid, and I was like, oh, that's what it's going to be. Yeah, no, I almost launched over the handlebars.
Yeah. So once you do that a time or two, that was my biggest fear, was getting pitched off the bike. But once I kind of did that, or tried to stop pedaling a couple of times, and I felt what it did to my body, you just don't do it anymore. So I started out racing on the road. I started racing road races and crits in 2013, and kind of became a crit racer, fell in love with crit racing. And in 2018, I was recruited to train and compete at Masters Track Worlds on a team pursuit squad. So team pursuit is, there are 4 team members. They ride in very close proximity to each other on the track for a set distance. And the goal is to either catch the team that is on the other side of the track or have the fastest overall time. And so the 4 women on that team, several of whom one was a world champion, 2 were national champions, and then the third was also a very strong road and crit racer. So we had kind of a variety of skill levels, a variety of track experience, but we spent a lot of time getting together, training at Trexlertown in Pennsylvania, at Rock Hill in South Carolina, because that year Worlds were in Los Angeles on a 250 meter track. So we spent a lot of time at Rock Hill on a 250 meter track. We raced at Worlds that October. We didn't do very well, but we had a lot of fun. And in the process of training for that, I threw my name in the hat and raced at nationals in July that summer, in the individual pursuit, which is where I won my first national championship in my first ever race on the track, which was really fun and really funny at the same time. And after Worlds 2018, I had all the equipment, and I enjoyed it, so I just kept at it and raced again at nationals in 2019 in Los Angeles, at Worlds in Manchester in October of 2019, and then did not race at all in 2020 or 2021 with COVID and a job transition. And then we found ourselves in early 2022. I wasn't quite sure what this season was going to hold. And then nationals were announced, I think maybe 6 or 8 weeks out from the competition. And so I started working really hard. I went to a training camp at Rock Hill, and then trained up and raced at nationals in June, and then worlds just a couple weeks ago in end of September in Los Angeles. And I had the good fortune of winning, I think, 4 more national titles in Indianapolis this summer. The points race, the individual pursuit, the 500, and then we set a national record in the team pursuit.
Oh, no way, that's awesome.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And everything that comes with that, you have to get drug tested. So USADA, I had to drive 10 hours back from Indy on a Sunday night, and USADA was at my door at 6 o'clock Monday morning. Yeah,
Oh, no
that's
way.
that's how it goes when you set a national record. USADA
So they
wasn't
don't do
at
that at the
nationals.
race?
They weren't there this year.
Oh, okay.
Oftentimes they are, and they at random pick every winner. Right, you win the race, you're randomly selected.
Yeah.
But they weren't there, I think, just capacity issues, and not enough USADA reps to kind of man the whole race. So they sent someone out to do that. And then yeah, and then worlds in October. um this year training was very much like, okay, worlds are in the US. This is the first time they're happening since 2019. So of course I'm gonna go, right? It wasn't until probably the last couple of weeks of training leading up to it where I was like, okay, I'm training for worlds. Like, I want to win a world title. I want to win rainbows, not just this is any other race. And so I took it very seriously. I usually take my training pretty seriously, but in the last couple of weeks, I really got very strict about everything: training, nutrition, sleep, all of it. And I had a blast, first of all. It was so much fun. The women across the US that race track are so much fun to race with, and such fierce competitors that yeah, it really was a lot of fun. They ended up combining some age groups because the fields were smaller than normal. And so, you're out there racing with women from 35 all the way up to 54. And yeah, I had the good fortune of winning my age group in the scratch race. I got second in the points race, and I got third in individual pursuit and third in the team pursuit.
And so
So,
how is that race different in the atmosphere versus like other races and like just the USA tracks and all those?
mhm. Um, I would say the atmosphere, kind of the culture around track cycling is pretty consistent from the US to Europe and the other countries that have tracks and that are historically very strong in track racing. Um, the joy of worlds and having it in the US is, a lot of your US competition because you lined up against them at nationals, right? But then there's the kind of wild card of the international folks that show up. And so in our age group, there were two, myself and one other American, and then a girl from, I take that back, depending on the race, there were either one or two other Americans. There was a woman from the UK, and then a woman from Poland who is fierce in the individual pursuit. I mean, she just, like, me and the other American, we looked at each other and we're like, we can't touch that time. Like, that is just so fast. Like, there's just impossible. So she was at Manchester in 2019 as well, and she's super, super strong. So it's a very, like, you finish the race and you all get off the track and you're all patting each other on the back type of culture. There's a lot of camaraderie. when you're on the track competing against each other, you're competitors. And then when you're in the infield getting ready or getting, finishing whatever it is, you're friends and compadres, so to say. So it's a very inclusive, friendly culture at track.
And so you said that, is there a points race? And is
Mhm.
that different? So how are the different races like from scratch to points race? And
Yep. So there are a lot of different races on the track. A scratch race is essentially a crit on the track. So there's a set distance.
that
Yep.
sounds crazy.
Yeah, there's a set distance, and the first person across the line is the winner after that distance. So I think our scratch race was a 5K. So they started us all, there's some like attacks in there and surges and people who try to get away. But for the most part, it stayed pretty high speed. It stayed together for the most part. There were a few, folks who tried to launch an attack. What made it challenging was figuring out whether that person was actually in your race and someone that, and if they weren't, was it someone who could get away that you want to latch onto and go with? Or is it somebody who's just trying to see if anyone else is going to respond? So that made it a little challenging, like just trying to keep track of the other women who were in my race specifically, because we were, multiple age groups
Oh, okay,
racing
okay.
together. Mm-hmm. So similar to a cross race when there's multiple fields on course and someone's coming up behind you and passes you and you're like, oh, they're not in my race. Like that sort of thing. Except you're always all in one big clump together on the track. So that's the scratch race. The points race is longer. So that was, I think, I want to say 15K. I should remember these distances. I just get out there and go. But every 5 laps, I think, every 5 or 10 laps, um, there was a sprint for points. And so the first, second, third, and fourth racers across the line get, points decreasing to from first to fourth.
So are
And
those
then
called preems in track like they are in crits and all that?
no, they're called a points lap.
Oh,
But
okay, okay.
yeah, essentially, instead of a prize or something, you get points.
Oh, okay.
Um, yep. And then the last sprint is double points. And then there's things like if you lap the field, then you go up 20 points. If you get lapped, you lose 20 points. And I apologize to all my track racer friends out there if I'm getting any of this wrong. I am still such a novice that, like I said, I line up and pedal. But the points race was, oof, yeah, it was challenging this year. There were, every time there was a sprint, it was super fast, super hot. And then there would either be a counterattack, and so the pace would stay high, or it would slow down so much that those of us who weren't at the front getting points would almost like we'd have to slow down. So there was a live stream, and the live streams are still up and posted, so you can go watch them. But I was doing a lot of talking and communicating with the women because there was so much just like jostling around and maneuvering for position. There were some really close calls. Like I almost got rammed into the rail at one point, at the top of the track. So just communicating to people to stay where they are and don't change up or down track, and to keep pedaling ahead if you're coming up on somebody. Most of that, as my coach told me after the race, was my fault because I was in places I should not have been. Well, you shouldn't have been in the back, you shouldn't have been whatever, passing someone above them on the. So I still have a lot of learning to do in regards to that.
But you're
But
still winning. So
I am. Yeah. There comes a time where, you just got to pedal hard and get across the line first, and that's what matters. And I was able to do that. So yeah,
yeah,
it's
absolutely.
it's fun. It's
Yeah,
fun.
that's awesome. Yeah, it's cool to be able to make mistakes but still win and still
Mhm.
win worlds and
Mhm.
nationals. Like that's pretty
Mhm.
awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good learning experience. And then there's also, for me, one of the hardest parts is when your race is over, you got to get slowed down, number one. Like you just, sprinted or poured all of your energy out to get across the line, and you can't stop pedaling. You have to keep going. And on a 250, you have to go at a high enough speed that you don't slide down the track. You can't just slow down and then ease it out, right? And so for me, the after the race, getting off the track and doing it quickly enough, because they run the races, and you got to get off. They're doing the next one. There's no waiting around, and you're spent. You get off and you can hardly even pull your foot out of the pedal because you're just exhausted. So that's always been the hard part for me. One of the hard parts for me is getting off the bike and getting off the track and out of the way after the race is over. So.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I used to love watching those Red Hook crits, and
Mhm.
just seeing any fixie crit when not only are they always pedaling, but they're always having to make their legs work so hard just to slow down. I'm like,
Mhm.
how are you not passing out after like 5 laps? I'd be dead. But yeah, I can only imagine, especially with track.
Yeah.
But so
Yeah.
for the distance, you were saying that the scratches was a 5K and then the points was a 15K. Do they change the
15 or
distances
20.
based off the race or?
So interesting that you asked that. After Worlds, there was an interesting kind of social media conversation going on about the fact that women's races, the distances of ours are often half the distance of the comparable age group on the men's side.
Mhm.
So they're, you know, the men 40 to 44 get to race I don't know what it is, 10, 15, 20K scratch race where we're doing five. So it's just an interesting conversation around that. But um, I think the distances are pretty consistent between nationals and worlds
Okay.
um, for
So they're
the
not changing like
masters.
before every race. They're not like, oh,
No,
this time okay, gotcha.
no, it's a set distance when you register. Like you'll see what it is when you register and that sort of thing.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Yeah, yeah,
That's interesting that they're doing the men do 10 to 15 and the women only do 5. I don't
yeah,
like that.
yeah. It's a thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But it's stupid.
Hmm.
You were talking about slowing down, and if you go too slow, you'll slide down the velodrome. And I've never biked on a velodrome, but I've always been curious. So, what is it like? I know that there's an incline and then there's a steeper
Hmm.
incline on the turns and stuff on the corners, but is there any how does it differ than just like riding down the road on your bike?
Yeah, so every track is different, depending on the distance and just the way the track was built. So I train primarily at Rock Hill, which is a 250-meter track, and the banking is 42 and a half degrees. So that means at the apex of the corners, as you would, like it's an oval shape, from the very top to the very bottom, it's the same 42 and a half degrees. It just seems steeper when you're at the top because there's further to fall. And so in order to stay on the track and not slide down, there's a minimum speed that you have to maintain. And I think at Rock Hill, it's something like 16 or 16 and a half, something like that. Um, and that is to make sure that your momentum is moving forward. There's enough momentum to carry you forward and that you don't just slide down. Um, Los Angeles is also a 250-meter track. It's indoor and it's wooden. And for me, riding on the first time I rode on LA, I was like, this thing is slick. I'm just going to slide right off of this. Right. And then there's sponsor banners on the track, some of which have been there long enough that the corners are like peeling up. And you're like, if I hit yeah. So
Oh, goodness.
all sorts of things. So it is important to maintain a minimum speed. Now, some of the more sophisticated and experienced racers have specific tires that they'll use on wood versus cement, indoor, outdoor, that sort of thing. I'm not there yet. I'm not that sophisticated. I glue on, or I have the shop glue on whatever it is they told me to get, and that's what I use. Some of, like, I think one of my tires has been glued since 2018, and it just still holds 140 psi. So that's what we use. um, so there, it can get very, very, dialed in for some people. But I'm not there yet. So yeah. I will say during the match sprints, one of my teammates and friends did slide down. She just wasn't going fast enough. They were kind of playing the cat and mouse game during the match sprint, and she just, wanted to check out the boards on the track. So she slid right down and got back up and restarted the sprint. She's fine. There's not really a whole lot of damage usually ever done. Maybe some splinters and a torn kit or something, but nothing
Ooh,
major.
splinters are brutal. Are you
Yeah.
penalized if you crash?
Um, and no, if it was an accident, but if there was unsafe riding involved in it, right? So in some of the men's races, there were people doing like if you move into the sprinters lane when it's already occupied and you cause a crash, then yes, you get either relegated or penalized or expelled or whatever. But if it's just an accident, you slide down, then no.
And so, what is the sprinter's lane? Is that the stripe that's like down closest to?
Yeah. So the very inside of the track, the shortest distance around the track is the black line. And then up from that is the red line. So between the black and the red is a sprinter's lane. If you're riding above the red line and there's someone in the sprinter's lane, you are not allowed to enter. You have to either go faster and get in front of them or slow down and pull in behind them.
Interesting. Okay.
Yes. Yes. And
Wow.
then
Sorry, I'm
above,
just like thinking about
no,
this.
it's
This is
okay.
wild.
It's okay. And then further above the red line is the blue line. And that when you're riding on the track, not really doing any effort, just warming up or, just riding laps, you want to be at the blue line or above so that you're out of the way of anyone who's doing efforts or specific training below that in the sprinter's lane.
So say that someone speeds up past them and gets in front of who's ever in the sprinting lane, does that
Mm-hmm.
force them to then have to get out of the sprinter's lane?
Mm-mm.
Okay, and then they can just start tailing.
Yep.
Okay, gotcha. Wow.
Yep.
I've already learned so much already.
Yeah. And so, I mean, that's the thing, right? At the end of the race, you want to travel the shortest distance to get to the finish line. But if the sprinter's lane is occupied and you're not going to be able to get around them, if you're in the sprinter's lane, you have to take that further distance around and put out more power if you're going to get around them, right? So there's a lot of strategy things that I don't have yet. But I'm thinking about maybe trying match sprints at some point. I haven't done that event yet, so would need to really get some strategy practice in because that is a big game of cat and mouse and very strategic. So
Yeah, I was about to ask about some tactics and stuff. And so
mhm.
if I'm sure you have insight, could I hear some of the tactics and stuff that you'd have to do, especially if you have like a team or something?
Yeah, so there's not a whole lot of teamwork that takes place in track racing.
Okay.
Um, and I don't have other than the team pursuit, which is a total team event. It's just the four of you or four of you and one other team on the track at the same time. Um, and I don't have personal experience in doing mass start races, so like the scratch race or the points race
Hmm.
with other teammates. But like I said, there's not really a whole lot of teamwork that happens. Um, the most, and I'm still at the very basic level of learning strategy. And my coach would affirm that as I get off the track, and he's like, "Go watch the live stream and watch this person. She knows what she's doing." Um, the biggest strategy thing that I can speak to is using the track, right? So if you um, if someone is attacking, right, you don't necessarily want to go take the longest line up and above and around everyone to get on that attack. But if there's someone below you in the sprinter's lane, then you've got to, figure out whether they're going to go or if you need to go where you are and then dip down into the sprinter's lane. So that's one thing. The other is when you find yourself up high, using the banking of the track to your advantage. Like you can get speed coming down, the track from coming out of a corner. So that type of thing, like I said, at the very basic level, is just learning how to use the track to your advantage. And then beyond that, I still have a lot to learn, which is both fun and intimidating at the same time. But Yeah.
Is that a term for like, is there a term for it when you go up high and then you use the embankment to speed down? Because I always see that in, like, Instagram reels and stuff, just people going up high
Mhm.
and kinda shooting down.
Not that I know of. There might
Oh,
be, but I not that I'm aware of.
yeah,
No.
we're just gonna make one up.
Yeah. Yep.
So besides obviously riding on the track and just getting
Mhm.
your normal training in, what other bits of training got you to the top of the podium for these races? Were you doing,
Yeah.
like, any weightlifting or anything, or what did that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I started working with a different coach or a new coach this past spring, and noticed right away like the difference in my training. The first week, I think the term that I used was demoralizing. I attempted to do the workouts, and I went back to my coach and I was like, "Are you sure these targets are like?" I don't think it's possible for me to hit that number,
That's
let
when you know
alone
it's good.
hold it right. And so it was like, okay, I'll adjust the targets, but like, no, this is the workout. You got to do it. And so I kept at it. Um, the main difference was a real focus on leg speed. Right? There's two ways to generate power. One, brute force, and the other is leg speed. And it's really the combination of brute force and leg speed that's going to get you the most power. And so that was the first kind of hurdle that I had to get over was getting used to doing my intervals at 100, 110, 120 RPMs. Yeah. And I mean, I'm a crit racer prior to my track racing experience. I prefer to ride at a higher cadence. I'm more aerobic. I was endurance, consider myself more of an endurance athlete. But it was a big leap. Um, and now you'll hardly find that any of my rides average a cadence, once you take out all the coasting time below 95. Like
Oh, wow.
yeah, I'm just a very high cadence rider. Um, there was a period of time. So when nationals were announced, there wasn't really enough time to do a strength block and get in all of the on the bike training that I needed before nationals. So we decided to kind of forego the strength piece and just focus on the bike training. So it's all very anaerobic at high cadence. I think is the greatest level of detail I can probably go into. My pursuit was a 2K, so I was doing 3 minute, basically all out as high as I could sustain for 3 minutes.
And what was
At
your
a
heart rate during those races?
I have trouble getting my heart rate up on the track. During training, I can get my heart rate up during crit races. On the track, for whatever reason, I was so excited when I finished the scratch race, and I was like, "Oh, my heart rate went up to 165."
Oh,
Like,
get out of here. That's crazy.
yeah, yeah. So, but during training, yeah, I can hold threshold or higher heart rate for the most of my intervals.
Wow.
Um, in
165 though,
between.
that's crazy to do the race and be done and then, oh, 165. That's
Yeah, mine it doesn't.
that's
So I
crazy.
I think earlier this season in August, I had the itch to crit race, and so I went up to the DC area, back to the DC area. I lived there for 15 years, and did a couple of crit races, and my heart rate got up into the 180s when I at the finish sprint. So,
That's where I stay with crit races, and I've hit up to 195, 198, and it was yeah, so I'm like, that's somewhat normal for me, I guess, in crit
mm,
races. I couldn't
yeah,
imagine doing a crit race at, like, 165. I'd probably
yeah.
win.
Well, on the flip side of that, my resting heart rate, both leading up to like in my taper weeks before nationals as well as my taper weeks before worlds, my resting heart rate is like 34, 35.
Oh, wow, okay. So when you go to the doctor, they're like, "We have a problem finding your pulse."
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
I've
My
been
dad's the
asked
same way. Yeah.
to get up and do jumping jacks. We can't do this reading. Like we need you to move.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's when you know you've
So
made it.
yeah. In between nationals and worlds, we had a little bit of a bigger time window, and so I was able to incorporate more strength training, a lot of squats, deadlifts, as well as upper body, because with standing starts, you're, standing in the start gate at a complete stop, and there's a lot of upper body strength required to get the bike going. Um, Standing starts are a very kind of violent, very strange thing to master. And yeah, they can, you can lose some good time on a bad standing start. Um, so twice a week I was doing incorporated strength training up until I would probably say 4 or 5 weeks out, and then I kind of transitioned over and was fully on the bike. Now that we're in the off season, same thing. I'm back to 2 days a week, 90 minutes in the gym doing weightlifting. So yeah.
And so how long was the block between when you got the new coach and then you did your first track race?
Um, I got the new coach. I want to say it was April or May. It was April. It was like Easter weekend, I think, actually. And the nationals were in the middle of June.
Oh,
So
okay. So you had a
yeah,
little bit of time,
yeah,
but just not enough for the strength training.
yeah. No. Um, at, and at that point, most of the athletes that he was working with that were also racing at nationals had been working with him for, they're either he was their coach previously, or they had started, and were already well into the training block. So I kind of came in the middle of it. Um, Fortunately, I didn't come from a complete stop. Like I had been riding, I just hadn't been training with real intention and discipline prior
Mm,
to that.
yeah, absolutely.
So yeah.
And so talking about your heart rate being so calm and stuff, what's going through your head when you get to the line and you're about to so scratch everyone is like kind of a rolling start, correct?
So they split the field, and half of the field lines up at the rail. So at the start line, um, and lined up one by one at the start line in a line at the rail, and then there's another group lined up one in front of the other at the blue band, the apron of the track, and your coach or some other person is holding you until they blow the whistle, and then they kind of like push you off, right? Because again, you're not, you can't coast. You're starting from a stop. So that standing start is not quite the same as a standing start for a timed event. So what they do for that is you walk up the stairs to, or out there to the start line. They take your bike, put it in what's called a starting gate, and it's a machine that holds your bike, and it will not let go of you until that timer is dropped to zero. Yeah. And then once it's in the starting gate, you walk around and you get in, and then the countdown is already going at that point usually. Most of the time, what's going through my mind is finding my focal point for the standing start. So when I first started doing them, I was like looking down straight in front of me. Well, that meant that I was going to roll off the track, right? Because I was going to go where I was looking. Um, and since then, have done a lot of practice standing starts, and I know um, that I need to find my focal point out where I want to go, and that has helped a lot. And then I just repeat to myself, hips first. I gotta. It's very different than starting to ride your bike out on the road where you can go back and forth. This you gotta hold it firm, and your body has to go back and forth, and your legs, and it's a whole machine, a whole mechanism that has to go in the right order. But just kind of talking myself through what I need to do, and once I get up and going and have speed, then it's just a matter of tolerating the pain and pushing through it.
Wow,
So,
yeah, that's interesting.
yeah.
Because I think it's for me, if I had to focus on a process of like starting, that would probably be way better for my nerves because I'm just like
Hmm.
so nervous, so anxious, so just butterfly and giddy.
Hmm.
So having to think about like, okay, well now hips first, focal
Hmm.
points and everything, I think that'd probably be really good for me.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing that was a big learning curve for me for track was the warm up protocol, right? Like with the crit race, you know what time your race starts. It's posted. You know you're going to go after this other 30-minute race that's happening before you. But in track, it's not like that. There is an order of events. And the amount of time that each event takes is dependent on how many people there are, how many match sprint rounds they have to go through, how many IP heats they have to run. Fortunately, my coach creates this massive spreadsheet that captures all of it. He's been doing this for years, how much time it takes for each one, and he's keeping it updated as the session goes on. So it's really kind of a guessing game within a range of like when you should start warming up. Track warm ups are short, they're quick, and then you sit and you wait. You sit and you wait, and you sit and you wait. I'm not good at that. It's just more time for me to get nervous, right? Like in road, you can be out spinning around, waiting, and then you can just go straight, roll up to the line. No. In track, you've got to sit and wait, and they take your bike. And so that was one really big adjustment I had to make, was just getting used to the fact that I do my warm up, and then I probably am going to be sitting here for 5, 10, hopefully no more than 15 minutes before I get on my bike and actually do my event. So
And is
a
your warm
lot of,
up with rollers, or what does that look like?
eventually it will be. I warm up on the, I have a feedback trainer. My goal this winter is to do more than just a 1 hour recovery ride on the rollers. That's as far as I've gotten this to date. Um, Most people warm up on rollers, yes, and I'm totally envious of the people who can get up to 180 RPMs and not fly off those rollers, because
Yeah,
I'm
and
not
then
there
on a
yet.
bike with no brakes, just throw that
Hmm.
into the mix as if you want to make it harder. And then why not?
Hmm.
Yeah. It's a
Yeah.
perfect equation.
Hmm. Yeah. So no, it's I have a lot of fun watching other people warm up on rollers and just
Especially like when
stare
they're
in
using no
amazement.
hands and they're just kind of coasting and stuff. It's like, wow, you
Hmm.
bike a lot.
Hmm. Yep.
So now we've touched on coaching, and you're a coach too.
Hmm.
And so how long have you been a coach?
I've been a coach for almost 7 years, so just over 6 years.
And so what does it take to become like a USA cycling certified coach?
Yep. So there are a variety of different certifications, coaching certifications out there, right? Um, I think I chose to go through the process for USA Cycling as the governing body for racing, bike racing in the US. Um, and what's required is at the very first level, there's a kind of level 3 coaching manual. Um, it's an open book test, so you can have that manual with you while you are taking the exam, and then you also have to provide proof of insurance, as well as participate in and complete safe sport training, which is all about ensuring that the relationship between a coach and an athlete is healthy and safe and respecting boundaries. And a lot of it is in regards to working with juniors or minors. Um, and You have to complete that and then renew that, I think, every other year, as well as your coaching certification.
Nice. And so do you look for any specific type of cyclist to coach, or do you just allow any type of cyclist to come to you and be like, hey, I want to do X or whatever?
Yeah, great question. So over the 6 or 7 years that I've been coaching, have coached crit racers, I've coached triathletes, I've coached aqua bike athletes. I right now I have somebody whose primary focus is gravel. Does a little bit of cross as well, but is really focused on gravel. So really a variety of endurance athletes, primarily cyclists, on the kind of athlete coaching side.
And so you just said aqua bike. What is
It's
that?
a triathlon without the run. So they do the
Oh,
swim
okay.
and then they do the bike. Yep, but there's no they get to skip out on the worst part of the triathlon. If
Dang.
you ask
Okay.
me,
Gotcha.
I hated the run when I did
Yeah.
triathlons, but
Yeah. Same.
yeah. So
Okay.
that's what
So when you
I
said
do.
aqua bike, I got something sent to me on Instagram from somebody, and it's literally this person that has like a bike that they ride on top of the water. And I thought that's what you were talking about. And I was like, holy crap, that's amazing. I was like, have you seen my
No,
story? But no, okay. That's good.
isn't that called a pedal boat?
A pet see, I don't know. I've been taking a poll on Instagram to see what everyone thinks it's called. I
I love
think I
it.
called it aqua cycling or whatever, so
Sounds about
a
right.
pedal boat? Is that what you said?
Yeah, well, yes, I
That's
think
awesome.
that's
I'm
what
gonna
they're
put that
called.
in the poll as well. Well, I'm glad we could discuss that. So when they come to you and they're like, "Hey, I want you to coach me," what are some of the
Mhm.
is there any questions or stuff that you have to ask them to figure out if they're gonna be a right match for you?
Yeah, and that's a huge part of the process, because we're strong believers in the coach athlete relationship, right? Like sometimes, I'm fortunate to say that I haven't encountered a lot of this, but sometimes personality matches mismatches happen, right? Not every coach's approach fits with every athlete's desires or needs. um, we do have a pretty thorough questionnaire. We tell people to set aside 20, maybe 30 minutes to complete it. And it's everything from what kind of bike do you ride? What equipment do you have? Power meter, heart rate monitor, wheels, like are you riding a 1990 Richard Marks or Richard Sachs, I guess is his name, that makes frames, or are you riding, the high end Madone, da 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 da. And all the way from equipment to what is your regular training regimen. So, do you ride every day of the week? How much time do you have to train? We also are really big on bike life balance. We have some athletes that we absolutely insist that they take Sundays off and spend it with their family, things like that. So we want to get as much information about the athlete, and their context, as well as their goals, before we start working with them, right? Sometimes we have folks who come and say, well, I just want to be a better cyclist. And that's great, but it's really helpful to put some tangible, actual goals to that. I'm very goal oriented in my coaching and my work, in general. And so having something to work towards and know what we're building to is really helpful.
And so when someone says, "I wanna become a better cyclist," and you're like, "Hey, you need to get tangible goals," it's like, what would be some tangible goals for that person?
So, for example, I have an athlete who's kind of in that boat, and their goal was to complete a century within a certain designated time, right? Whether it was under 5 hours or whatever the goal is. So, something like that is a tangible thing to work towards. Um, Others who say, I wanted to, I'm training for this 5 day tour across Montana or Yellowstone or Wyoming, whatever it is. That sort of thing requires a different type of training than an athlete who wants to do a crit or a Grand Fondo or um, track racing. um, so so having that kind of clear direction is helpful. We've also worked with some folks who, they're not gym people per se, but they want kind of a regular fitness regimen. And a lot of that ends up being, just basic endurance workouts, to maintain just a healthy lifestyle.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a coach, I think Iman Lucas, is over in the UK racing and stuff, but he's back over in the United States right now, but he was my coach and he did all the Red Hook crits and everything, and I was like, "I want you to coach me to get to move up the ranks in crits."
Hmm.
And it must have been 2019, I think, for
Hmm.
that year, and then COVID hit, and then I was like, "Okay, I'm sorry, I'm just gonna have to bail because I don't want to get burnt out on this. Like, there's no races happening or anything like that."
Yeah.
But for that year of 2019, that was amazing, just because
Hmm.
of having the structure, having
Hmm.
someone to hold you accountable, and it's
Hmm.
kind of like, "I'm paying you. I know that I'm gonna have to use this money, so let's make it worth it." It
Hmm.
was it was very beneficial, and I you could just see the miles rack up, you could see the FTP and the heart rate go
Hmm.
down, and it was fantastic, so I would strongly
Yeah.
encourage anyone who wants to use a coach to do that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to be said for structure and discipline and consistency, as well as a meaningful progression or progressive overload that we is what we call it in the coaching world, right? There's obviously benefits to group rides, but group rides make you better at group rides versus training and coaching in a specific way to prepare your body for the type of racing that you want to do and be successful at. I would say that was one of the hardest parts of training was giving up group rides, right? You know, the Tuesday night hill ride that I finally was able to revisit a couple weeks ago, and I'm like, man, it's still the same Tuesday night group ride. But everyone's like, where have you been? Why don't you ride? And I'm like, I'm training.
And I'm
And it
winning, suckers.
right, it was kind of fun to come home and be like, okay, so now do you understand why I wasn't coming to all these rides? I was busy getting ready, and I did actually win something. So
Yeah.
it's I really, really miss the social aspect. So there is a balance, right? In addition to being, you know, training you to be better at group rides, there's pack riding skills that you can develop in group rides and that sort of thing. So it's not entirely, you know, something you have to cut out completely, but in moderation and strategically placed within a training plan, I think is the way to go there.
Yeah, and you mentioned a good point too about consistency. It was kind of funny getting into cycling before I got the coach and not understanding how anyone could hit like 200 miles in a week. I was just
Mm-hmm.
like, that is, I feel like if someone hit 100 miles in a week, I was like, that's just stupid. Like, I don't see what they're doing. And then just getting consistent and literally just riding your bike every day, you're like, oh, that's manageable. Like, that's actually not that bad at all. It's just consistency, consistency, consistency. And then
Mm-hmm.
it all comes together once you just stay consistent with it. Your legs start to heal
Mm-hmm.
faster. You, your butt doesn't hurt as bad. Just like it's great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's also, you know, it's funny because I was the same way when I first started riding. I'm like, oh, I did this many miles for this many miles an hour and this much in a week. And once you start training for something like nationals or worlds, average speed, distance in a week, you begin to realize how little those things really matter, right? Like I finished my ride today and it wasn't until I like was like, oh, did it upload into Strava? And I was like, oh, I did almost 30 miles. Like
Yeah.
I didn't even bother to look at how many miles I'd done because I did my intervals, I hit my targets. That was what I needed to do.
Yeah.
And so it's just funny because there is a lot of focus on miles per hour. And depending on the conversation and the context in which it comes up, a lot of times I like to say, oh, so what does that mean about how hard the ride was? Like, what does miles per hour tell you?
Yeah.
Was it windy? You only averaged 17, and there must have been a headwind. Oh, you were 25. There must have been a tailwind.
Yeah.
No, you know. So, but it's still fun. You know, it's still a metric that people like to look at and track. And you know, the group ride was at 27 this week, but only 25 last week, and you know that sort of comparative stuff. So,
Yeah, there's a lot of people, diesel engines at the front of the group.
mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
so you were mentioning that when you ask the people, or not people, when you ask the potential clientele, I guess, to your coaching, and
Mm-hmm.
you ask them what type of equipment they have, like heart rate monitor and all that stuff, does the training change based off of what equipment they have? Or is it recommended to be like, hey, I would recommend getting a power meter or something like that?
Yeah. It is easiest to do training and coaching with a power meter. That's just the reality, right? Like it's the best measure of input, of intensity, easiest to manage in terms of hitting targets. Heart rate can be so variable, right? It can be number one, it's a delayed metric, right? You start an interval and you can immediately get to your 220 or whatever it is that you're trying to hit versus heart rate is slower to get up. So you're spending the first 30 seconds to a minute just trying to get into zone. Um, so that said, I did have an athlete, a multi-sport athlete who did not have a power meter, and we did all the training by heart rate. Um, Not ideal, right? So we usually do recommend that our athletes get power meters, but just having the power meter itself isn't always the end game, right? Especially if they haven't done an FTP test or there isn't enough data for the modeling software to kind of give you a good estimate of what their FTP might be. So getting set up and squared away with some of those things at the beginning can take a little bit of time. But I think it is worth it for athletes to invest in a power meter, depending on their goals. Again, if you've got the athlete that's just trying to maintain a healthy lifestyle and that sort of thing, a heart rate can be just fine. But for others, depending on their goals, power meter is usually preferable.
Yeah, that makes sense. That was one that I never had, and I feel like well, I did most of my training on Zwift just because it was
Hmm.
consistent and it was usually when I would do the training it'd be late at night, so at least that has some sort of meter in there. I don't know
Yeah,
accurate compared to one that's actually on the bike, but gives you a general idea of where you're at.
yeah,
But definitely buying a power meter is pretty ideal.
yeah, yeah. As long as whatever you have is consistent for you, that's what matters.
Yeah, definitely. And because you're a coach, but yet you also have a coach,
Hmm.
do you think that's helped you in
Hmm.
kind of, I guess, I don't know how to say it, getting on the same level as who you're coaching?
Yes. Um, and I often find myself, for example, earlier this week, I had super long work hours. I was leading a big project on campus and I wasn't able to do one of the workouts. And I was thinking about the comments that I was going to put into Training Peaks to let my coach know what the situation was. And I was like, I'm being one of my athletes. Like it annoys me to no end when I see excuses. And here I am making excuses. So I do think about things in that context. And then yeah, it has helped me think about and reflect on and improve my own coaching practice just with some of the workouts that I'm doing and seeing the benefit and kind of learning a different approach to kind of the same thing, is it's good exposure, to have that. And yeah, I'm kind of able to apply some new learnings to my athletes as well, which I think I saw some of the benefits of this year. It's a little bit later in the season when I started doing that, but I'm excited to try some new things next year.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd
So
be awesome to
yeah.
try to see it work on you and be like, "Oh, I know someone else that can use this as well."
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yep,
that's awesome.
exactly.
And so, how long have you had coaches?
Um, so I have had a coach, since 2014, 2014, 2015. Um, and I took a little bit of time off during COVID. I think we all did. I
Yeah.
just wanted to ride my bike, right? There wasn't really anything to train for. Just kind of went back to my roots and did the endurance stuff and mixed in the hard group rides when I wanted to. But yeah, pretty consistently, I would say, since once I got my Cat 2 on the road. Oddly enough, I made it from 4 to 2 without a coach. And I got
Nice.
to Cat 2 and started working with a coach. So I've been ever since.
And so, how can you see your needs through the years change as your,
Hmm.
I guess, your levels kept increasing?
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. So back in 20, I guess it would have been 2017 was the first year that I was eligible to race masters. And that year I trained up for and raced at Masters Road Nationals in Augusta, Georgia. And I would say that year was like the pinnacle of fitness for me. I would go out and do, this workout that we call make a crit racer wanna die type of thing. 5x5 VO2 with microbursts and then 5x5 again and more microbursts. And I would finish those workouts and just feel amazing. My FTP was higher than it had ever been before and, all this good stuff. And then I got food poisoning the day
Oh,
before the race, and it was a
oh,
disaster. That sort of thing. I was like, oh, this is
oof.
too good to be true. Yeah, I ended up doing the race. I hadn't eaten in 3 days, and I still finished the crit. So it was fun. It didn't feel very good, but and then looking, I can look back in Training Peaks and kind of see that peak. Um, and then I transferred over to prioritize track racing in 2018, and the training was very, very different, all anaerobic. The metrics in Training Peaks kind of don't mean as much, or they mean things different than what they do when you're training for road. the taper in track is much longer because you spend so much more time at anaerobic versus crit racing, which is a lot more VO2 and, kind of the in the middle stuff. So kind of experiencing that difference was new and eye opening. It has also helped me kind of not freak out as much over the metrics and training peaks. Because, I look at my CTL now and it's like a 50 something. And I'm like, that is terrible. That's horrible. I have no fitness. But relatively speaking, like I have all this anaerobic fitness built up. It's just the volume is different, which is why my chronic training load is lower. And, so having that experience and learning in that area has been really informative, and I've been able to like apply it in my own coaching.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wouldn't
Yeah.
exactly think about that switching, um, I guess, genre of cycling and stuff, or
Mm-hmm.
but that's yeah, that's pretty interesting because I know like Strava does it too for a lot of people. Like, oh well, my
Mm-hmm.
numbers are lagging. I need to get them up and stuff like that. So I need to go for a long ride and all that stuff. But to know and actually understand the numbers
Mm-hmm.
is going to be very beneficial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the different energy systems, right? Like, and I listen to the Trainer Road Ask a Cycling Coach podcast a lot. And they were talking today about how, you can have the same intensity factor for two different rides that worked two very, very different systems, right? Like maybe the intensity factor was 0.8 and one person did a lot of tempo with short endurance recovery, and another person did very, very high and very, very low, and they just kind of both evened out. But the two athletes who did those two workouts worked very different energy systems in their bodies, and the workouts had different purposes, right? So um, kind of getting into that level of detail and those intricacies, um, I love it. I love nerding out over
Yeah, it's
that kind
pretty
of stuff.
interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. And so to go back
So
on one thing that you said, how did you do in the race that you had food poisoning after?
I finished it. I think I was last, but I
Hey,
remember I remember after the race saying if I hadn't had food poisoning, that would have been my race. Like I would have won that thing. It was sufficiently hard, and I had enough fitness that even without having eaten anything, and I even like went into the portas and got sick again right before the
oh
race. I mean,
goodness.
yeah, partly because perhaps the amount of beet juice I was putting in my body, but nonetheless, to have finished it having been sick, throwing up, and all that stuff, food poisoning, what it does to you. I literally finished and I was like, if I hadn't been sick, I would have won that race.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah,
that's a tough feeling.
yeah, it was hard. It's okay, it
So
happens.
yeah, I mean, what can you do? That's a card you're dealt. That's the closest to wanting to die I've ever felt was getting food poisoning. Me and my wife
Yeah.
both caught it, and then so did my sister-in-law. My sister-in-law had to go to the hospital because she was so dehydrated.
Mm,
My wife was just sick all night. Then I saw it coming and I got like sick later in the night, and I was just like, well, let me just go to sleep right now so I can try to get a jump on this because I know I'm going to be up all night. But yeah, food poisoning. I hats off to you. I'm applauding you because that is so brutal.
yeah, it was miserable. It really was. But
And so, what's up with the beet juice? Because I know that you're a nutritionist. What's up with the
mhm.
beet juice, and why were you drinking so much for that?
Yeah. So I just to clarify, because I want to make sure we're clear on terms here. I'm a certified nutrition coach
Oh, okay.
versus a nutritionist or a dietitian. Yeah. So I'm on the beet train. Normally, when possible, I incorporate them in my diet, so I'm not, drinking a whole bunch of powders or juices or that sort of thing. Um, I don't I, despite having a degree in biochemistry, can't describe the full or mechanism, but the nitric acid helps buffer the lactic acid, or it increases the amount of oxygen that your muscles can process, and therefore delaying the onset of pain and cramping and discomfort that comes along with hard intervals. I have found it to be particularly, if nothing else, mentally beneficial. Placebo effect maybe. But I do think it does have an impact when, taken in moderation and at the appropriate time before a workout, that sort of thing. I have been known to mix a little bit of beet powder in one of my bottles on like a longer ride, and we'll try and drink that the first bottle so that I can stave off the pain later in the ride. Um, but yeah, I'm on the beet train solidly.
I am too because I don't know if you watch basketball or anything, but JJ Redick played for Duke.
Okay.
He in the NBA they did like a GQ did like a top 10 things you can't live without, and his was beets.
Hmm.
And because he was talking about the oxidization in your blood that happens
Hmm.
from eating beets. So
Hmm.
then I hopped on the beet train just from him, and I eat beets all the time,
Yeah.
but I never knew the full thing. I was like, I know it's oxygen
Yeah.
something, but that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. It allows your muscles to process more oxygen than normal. Thus, all the mechanisms that go into the pain that we experience, it buffers that. So, and I prefer, and it's actually more cost effective to just eat beets versus the
Yeah.
beet powder and the beet juice and all that kind of stuff. Just throw them on with my kale. Like that's
Yeah.
the best
No
way to
kidding.
have them. So, yeah.
So going into a track like a track meet, what what is like a healthy peak performance diet going into
Mm.
that? Like, is it a big breakfast? Do you kind of start doing it the day before and get all your carbs and stuff? Or what does that look like going into a race?
Yeah, good question. So, I think the first thing to keep in mind is the track efforts are very short, comparatively speaking, right? Individual pursuit is a 3-minute race. A 5K scratch race is maybe 12 minutes, right? They're not long. They are high intensity, so they're primarily consuming or require carbs because carbs are the energy source for quick, high intensity work like that. So there isn't really a whole lot of carb loading for me personally that goes into it. Being a certified nutrition coach, I do track my macros religiously on a daily basis. Since I started working with a nutrition coach in April of 2019, um, in that season, I dropped 30 pounds in 3 months just by shifting the composition of macros in my diet and tracking it and being really intentional about it. And anytime I deviate from my plan, as I did earlier this week, I feel like the Stay Puft Marshmallow. I have inflammation in my body. Like it's amazing how good I feel when I'm adhering and how terrible I feel when I'm not fueling my body properly, right? And I want to be clear that this is about proper fueling. It's not about elimination diet or fad diet or keto or anything like that, right? It is just properly fueling your body for what you're asking it to do. Um, I'll tell you kind of my nutrition plan specifically at Worlds. Um, I was consuming my last meal, which was for every single race, Birch Bender's paleo pancake mix. I
Okay.
had one pancake, and I would mix in like chocolate chips and some nuts and some coconut. And I would have that with some turkey and cheese, lunch meat, making sure I'm getting in all my protein. Um, and normally I have my last meal like 90 minutes or 2 hours before my workout. But at Worlds, I was having my last meal probably 3 and sometimes 4 hours before because I didn't know when I was going to be racing, right? Like I tried to judge it as close as I could. And I actually found that to be a lot better than the 1.5 to 2 hours that I've been doing here at home for training. So I'm actually going to shift my nutrition a little bit here at home. Um, but that was kind of like I had that before my first race and I had plenty enough energy and I felt great. And I was like, I'm repeating this all week. Like every single race, I'm going to do the same thing. And I was staying at a residence inn, where you have a little kitchenette and you can do your own thing. Um, so that's kind of how I fueled at Worlds. In terms of regular everyday training, definitely making sure that I'm getting in 35 to 40 grams of carbs in that last meal before my workout. Because because again, all the anaerobic high intensity stuff needs to have that quick access to carbohydrates versus the slow, low intensity workouts that are more fat burning. So yeah, and then just making sure post ride that I'm getting in that lean protein as soon as possible. The research on that kind of goes back and forth, but again, placebo effect for me, it makes me feel good, and I feel like it's, it kind of kickstarting the repair of all the muscles that I've damaged during the anaerobic stuff, and then of course, high quality carbs to restore the glycogen. So,
And so, what is
and
your
that's what
post race training ride protein of choice?
Um, apologies for the feline.
No, you're good.
It depends. If I have something prepared already, lean protein, so chicken breasts. I eat a lot of turkey, lean turkey as well. If I just want something really quick because I need to, move on to the next thing or whatever, I drink a lot of Premier protein shakes.
Okay.
You can get them at Costco. The flavors are decent. It's not chalky, and they're quick and easy. So,
Yeah, that used to be my go-to. I used to do like the orange creamsicle
mm,
um, powder with banana and blueberries, and then that was
hmm
just
yeah,
that was the best. It was like a
yeah,
dessert. I love it.
yeah, exactly.
And so, one of the last questions I want to ask you, just because we got onto the whole topic, what are some tips for breaking on a fixie for people?
Tips for breaking on a fixie. So it's all about modulating your pedal stroke. You don't want to. This is reminding me of one of my old friends in DC who rode a fixie a lot, and he would do like the tail whip
Yeah.
with the I can't do that. I remember watching him do it. Shout out to you, Zach. I don't recommend trying that because I don't know how to explain how to do it. Um, but it really is about modulating your pedal stroke, and rather than like jerking and pedaling backwards, just like slowly easing up on your forward pressure is kind of what I have found. Um, I will say I don't use a lock ring on my track bikes. So if I were like, my rings are on there pretty tight, but if I were to jerk back far enough, I could like loosen it and then the chain would be flying all over the place and that wouldn't be good. So I don't recommend that. Um, but it is a skill that you do want to practice.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So
Actually, just because you mentioned it now, I'm intrigued. So, last question I want to ask you about. So, your gear ratio, do you get to decide that? Or is it like a specific ratio that you have to use for tracks?
nope, you get to decide that. Well, I say you, my coach.
Okay,
I'm
okay.
like, what am I riding for this? Fortunately, I ended up riding the same gear ratio for every race at nationals and worlds. Um, which doesn't always happen. That's not always the case. But I was in a place where I felt comfortable with that gear. I could turn it over. I maybe could have geared up a little bit for the points race, which just makes my legs hurt because they were sore enough on the one that I used. But yeah, my coach is the one that kind of just, and mostly because again, I feel like such a novice that I'm like, you tell me. I don't,
Yeah.
yeah.
And was it the same ratio that you were like training with, or was it like we're training with this, but let's gonna go up one?
So that's an interesting point we didn't really talk about. The majority of my training was on my road bike. So I
Oh,
did
okay.
all of my outdoor training, all the high cadence stuff, all the anaerobic on my track bike or on my road bike. There were a couple weekends where I was down in Rock Hill for either clinics or specific training weekends for worlds where I was on my track bike. But I think between nationals and worlds, I really was only on my track bike. I want to say maybe 2 or 3 times.
Oh, wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I
So
mean, once again, it's working for you. Doesn't
yeah,
matter. Yeah.
it's true.
Yeah. So, I mean,
It's true. Yeah.
you're the champ. So that's all that matters.
Thanks. Yep.
Well, thank you so much for letting me interview you on here. I was very intrigued once I learned that you were going to nationals and then once you won nationals and then worlds too, because once again, I know nothing about track. So I'm really happy you were able to educate me about track racing. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me. This is a lot of fun. And yeah, we'd be happy to chat with you again or anybody else that wants to talk about bike racing and coaching and nutrition and all that fun stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.